The sun clawed its way over the ridges of the high plains, setting the horizon afire with a dull orange that made the dust shimmer like embers. In the town of Dry Creek, the morning was already thick with the smell of sweat and stale whiskey. The boardwalks creaked under the weight of boots and wagon wheels, and the faint scrape of a broom against wood seemed almost too loud against the stillness that hung between buildings like a held breath. Tom Callahan rode into town on a chestnut. Mare, her flanks slick with sweat, the reins loose in his calloused hands. He was a quiet man, quiet to the bone, with eyes that had seen too much and a jaw set as if holding back the memory of every loss. His hat was pulled low, shadowing the faint scars that traced across his cheek. He didn't speak much, and the town seemed to notice, in the way people notice a storm cloud lingering behind a line of hills. He tethered the mare outside the saloon, the heat radiating off the boards making his boots stick. He could hear the faint strains of a piano inside, tinkling along with the coughs and laughter of men who'd already taken to drowning whatever conscience they still had in liquor. He paused at the doorway, scanning the room without the rush. To belong, the auction block was set up in the square later that morning. Dry Creek's mayor, a greasy man named Halvorsen, had announced it as a special event, though nobody who mattered didn't know it was a business transaction that reeked of something darker. Women, mostly, were lined up in the square like cattle, their hands bound loosely behind their backs, faces pale in the harsh sunlight. The auctioneer's voice cut across the heat, high, practiced, calling out bids while the men pressed forward, shoving elbows and smirking. Tom didn't move at first. He leaned against the post of the general store, watching the proceedings with a quiet patience that could slice through the loudest foolhardy laughter. He noticed a girl, barely 16, standing on the block with a look that didn't belong to her age. Her dress was torn at the hem, dust streaked across her arms, her eyes wide but fixed straight ahead. The first bid came, crude and low. A man with a hat pulled too far forward laughed as he raised a hand. Tom could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he stayed still, letting the scene unfold. The girl flinched slightly at the first slap of money against the wooden platform, the sound like a gunshot in the midday sun. Then came the second, higher, and the third, until the numbers climbed and the girl's face remained stoic. But Tom noticed the tremor in her fingers, the tightening of her jaw, the almost imperceptible shaking of her boots. That was when the hand came up behind her. Not for protection, not for comfort, just a grab to guide, to mark her as property. Tom's hand rested lightly on the butt of his revolver at his side, not in a hurry, not with flair. Just there, like a shadow waiting for the right moment. The auctioneer called out the final bid, a man with a glint in his eye that promised nothing good. The girl's shoulders stiffened. There was a faint whisper from her, almost inaudible. "Are you my father?" It was meant for nobody, and yet Tom heard it, as if the wind had carried it straight to him. He glanced at her, saw the flicker of hope in her eyes that was quickly drowned by fear, and he realized that whatever law or order the town claimed to have didn't apply here. Not today. He stepped forward. "Hold it," he said, voice low, cutting through the murmurs and the shuffling of boots. Heads turned, some laughing, others narrowing eyes at the intrusion. Tom's gaze never left the girl's. "You?" The auctioneer barked, adjusting his body like it could protect him from what came next. "This here is an auction." "Ain't." "No interruptions?" Tom's hand tightened on the revolver. "I said hold it, she ain't for sale." A man near the front of the crowd laughed, but it was a hollow sound, unsure, because Tom Callahan didn't look like a man to laugh at. He was thin, not tall, but there was a weight in his silence that made the air itself hold its breath. The greedy bidder frowned, stepping forward. "And who the hell are you, boy?" "You think you can waltz in and—" Tom didn't answer. He didn't raise his gun yet. He just moved closer, each step measured, deliberate. The girl's eyes widened at the sight, the tiny ember of hope flickering again. "You don't want to do this," Tom said softly. The words carried a calm menace that cut sharper than any blade. The bidder sneered. "And what's that to you?" Tom reached into the folds of his coat and pulled out a small, worn letter, yellowed and creased. He held it up for the girl to see. Her name was written in a familiar, shaky hand, one that belonged to a woman who had fought for her child's survival. He didn't need to read it aloud. She understood, the crowd murmured, unsure now if the man in front of them was mad or worse. "You'll let her go," Tom said, "or you'll answer to me." The sheriff, a fat man with a bristling mustache, stepped forward. Now, ain't no need for threats." He laughed, nervously, sweat dripping down the sides of his face. "This is business, son, business." "Business don't mean you can stand on the bones of the helpless," Tom replied. The words were quiet but struck harder than any gunshot, for a heartbeat silence hung like a cloud of dust, choking the square. Then the bidder took a step forward, hand brushing against his revolver. Tom's hand went to his own. The girl flinched, biting her lip, the tension thick enough to taste. "You got yourself a choice," Tom said, calm, almost sorrowful. "Walk away or I make the choice for you." The crowd didn't breathe. Not a single horse whinnied, not a single fan of dust swirled in the air. Time itself seemed to pause. Finally, the bidder laughed, but it was brittle. "You're a fool," he said, turning to leave. Tom didn't move. He just watched him go, making sure the threat was carried out without firing a single shot. Then he knelt beside the girl, loosened her bindings, and offered his hand. She took it slowly, eyes wide, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." "You're safe now," he said, voice low, almost reverent. They walked away from the square. Together, the dust rising behind their boots, the town's murmurs fading into the wind. Tom didn't speak much, didn't offer comfort in words. But in the slow rhythm of his strides, the patient steadiness, the quiet protection, he spoke louder than any preacher. The girl looked up at him as they left the edges of town. "Are you my father?" she asked again, more hope than belief this time. Tom hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said, voice firm but kind, "but I can be someone who's on your side." "That's enough for now." They rode into the desert. Together, the sun hanging low and cruel above the horizon, painting the world in gold and blood. Behind them, the town of Dry Creek shrank, small and petty and insignificant compared to the weight of the choice made, the quiet act of justice that had no law to bless it but the one that lived inside men's hearts. The girl, now safe beside him, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Tom's eyes never left the horizon, where the next storm, the next injustice, waited. He didn't speak of his past. She didn't ask. But in the silence, in the unbroken rhythm of the horse's steps, the unspoken promise lingered. Sometimes the right thing is quieter than the law, and heavier than any gun. The desert stretched endless before them, and for the first time in a long while, Tom Callahan felt the faint stirrings of something like hope, not for himself, not for glory, but for the girl whose name he now carried with him as carefully as a prayer. The desert road was long and lonely. The wind rolled off the ridges in waves, carrying the grit of sand across their faces. The girl rode quietly, her small hands gripping the reins of a borrowed pony, her eyes flicking nervously to Tom, who had taken the larger horse without a word. The silence between them was neither uncomfortable nor empty. It was full of things neither dared voice. Tom had seen enough of the world to know that silence could weigh heavier than speech. He kept his gaze forward, scanning the horizon, watching. The long shadows of cacti stretch across the dry earth like fingers reaching for something lost. "What's your name?" he asked at last, voice low. The words came slowly, as if dredging them up from some long-buried place. "Clara," she said, almost a whisper. She didn't look at him as she spoke. Her eyes were fixed on the ground ahead, following the dust trail that stretched like a gray ribbon across the plain. "Clara," he repeated, tasting the name. "All right, Clara, we'll make sure you're safe." She shivered, not from cold the sun still pressed down with relentless heat, but from the memory of hands that had tried to claim her like a thing, from the fear that had lived in her chest. "For days, you don't talk much," she said after a long pause, the words small and tentative, like she was testing him. Tom gave a faint shrug, the kind that said more than it seemed. "Most people don't need to hear me talk." She studied him, noting the deep lines at the corner of his eyes, the way his fingers were calloused and scarred, the faint twitch in his jaw. There was a weight in him she couldn't name, something older than the land they rode through, something that said he'd been through fire and still walked forward. After a long stretch, the desert opened into a canyon. Tom slowed his horse, letting Clara's pony catch up. They stopped by a small wash where water still lingered, stagnant and green. He tied the animals to a nearby mesquite and knelt to cup water in his hands, offering it to her. She drank slowly, wary, then looked at him. Why? Why help me? Tom met her gaze, eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. He said nothing at first, then, quietly, because someone ought to. Doesn't matter who. Doesn't matter why? She nodded, not fully understanding, but accepting the answer because it was enough. Night fell quickly in the desert, dragging cold behind it like a thief. Tom found a sheltered nook beneath a rock overhang, stacked some brush to make a crude bed, and handed Clara a blanket. He built a small fire, the flames flickering and crackling against the darkness, shadows dancing across his face, across hers. She stayed quiet for a long time, watching the fire. Then, softly, "Did you ever lose someone?" Tom's hand froze. Over the firewood. He looked at her, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was slow, deliberate. "More than I can count," he said. "Lost to dust, to fire, to bullets, doesn't make it easier?" She nodded again. Silence settled around them, the kind of silence that feels like a conversation with the past. The next day, they rode through the hills, and Tom kept watch as the land stretched open, the sun baking the earth, the wind relentless. By mid-afternoon, they saw the faint outline of another settlement, a cluster of wooden buildings, a lone windmill turning lazily in the distance. "It's small," Clara said, squinting. "Good," Tom said. "Small towns have less to chew on someone like us." But the town, called Redridge, was already awake to their coming. As they entered, the street buzzed with the low hum of suspicion. Children peeked from behind fences. Men leaned from doorways, eyes narrowing at the sight of the stranger and the girl. And somewhere, beyond the wooden facade of the sheriff's office, a pair of eyes followed, calculating, greedy. Tom tethered the horses outside the town's only inn. He scanned the faces that lingered at windows and doorways, noting how the men's hands itched for something heavier than their boots would carry. "You think they'll—" Clara began, her voice trembling. "They will," Tom interrupted softly. "But we move slow, careful. We only fight when we have to." Inside the inn, the air was cool but smelled of stale ale and unwashed cloth. Tom rented a room for the night, keeping the door between them and the rest of the world. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, brushing the dust from her dress, while Tom unpacked what little gear he carried. "You ever been to Redridge?" she asked. "No," he said, "not this far east." She hesitated. "Do you regret it, coming out here?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He simply stared out the window at the fading light, watching the street below. Then he said quietly, "Regret is for people who stay put. I don't do that." The next morning brought trouble. A rider appeared at the edge of town, wearing a leather duster that had seen better days, a rifle slung across his back. He rode straight to the sheriff's office and dismounted, slamming the reins against the post. The sheriff, a fat man with a mustache that bristled like the desert brush, came out to meet him, red-faced and sweating. Tom watched from the inn's balcony as the conversation grew heated. Words were thrown, fists threatened, and then the rider leaned closer to the sheriff, voice low. The sheriff's face paled. He turned to the street, scanning for something or someone. Tom's hand brushed the revolver at his hip. He didn't move, didn't show himself, but he knew the danger had arrived. The rider, it seemed, had connections to Dry Creek, connections that smelled of revenge and profit. By midday, men were gathering in the town square, whispering about the stranger who had brought a girl out of the desert, the one who had no law behind him and only the weight of his own conscience. The whispers became louder, the tension sharp. Tom didn't wait for them to act. He led Clara to the back of the inn, down a narrow alley that emptied into the hills behind Redridge. They rode in silence, climbing until the town was nothing more. Then a collection of shadows in the valley below. We can't hide forever, Clara said, glancing over her shoulder. No, Tom said. But we can make them come to us on our terms. Night fell again, and the desert swallowed them in darkness. Tom taught Clara how to move quietly, how to read the wind, how to keep her fear from giving her away. They slept under the stars, the cold biting, the fire just a small flicker to hold back the blackness. Days passed like that. And then, one evening, the men came. Not many, but enough to know they meant business, a posse of 3 riding hard, their boots kicking up dust. Like storms. Tom had been waiting, and when they found him and Clara, he didn't hesitate. The confrontation was brief. A shot rang out from the rocks above, and one of the riders toppled. Tom's hand was steady, deliberate, unerring. The remaining 2 hesitated, unsure if they were dealing with a man or a force the desert itself had carved from stone. Leave, Tom said, voice low, quiet, final. They did. One by one, turning their horses toward the horizon, leaving only the echo of fear behind them. Clara clung to him after shaking. Was that wrong? No, Tom said. It was necessary. He didn't speak of the past, of the people he'd lost, of the blood on his hands. That was his burden. Clara didn't ask. And in that silence they rode forward. Together, the desert stretched endless before them, and as the sun rose the next morning, Tom realized something he hadn't in years. There was a sliver of hope in protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. And maybe, in some small way, that could atone for all the failures that had carved the lines into his face, into his hands, into his heart.